The morning light filters softly through the small window of your humble home, casting a pale glow on the clay walls. You stir from sleep. The scent of the earth and the lingering warmth of the fire that still crackles low in the hearth surrounding you. The air feels crisp, carrying with it the earthy smell of damp soil and the distant sounds of morning life beginning to stir in the village outside. You rise from your woven mat, your feet finding the coolness of the floor as you move towards the hearth. The fire's low glow dances across your surroundings, the faint scent of wood and herbs hanging in the air. As you prepare for the day ahead, the familiar sounds of your home, the scrape of a clay pot being moved, the soft clink of wooden spoons, and the hushing murmur of voices surround you. Your first task of the day is simple, yet deeply ingrained in the rhythms of life: to prepare your drink. Maybe it's water, fresh from the well that sits at the heart of your village. Or perhaps it's a more comforting, familiar brew of fermented drink, something your ancestors have made for generations. Imagine now the act of drinking, the coolness of the water against your lips, the rich, yeasty taste of fermented grains or fruits. You take the first sip of the day, and in that quiet moment you feel the connection to your ancestors, to the many generations who have risen from sleep and quenched their thirst in much the same way. The drink isn't just a way to nourish your body. It's part of something far deeper. It's a lifeline, an essential element of survival, and a central piece of the intricate tapestry that defines daily life. Drinks were not just a matter of thirst in the ancient world, they were a bridge to the spiritual, a tool for social connection, and a vital part of every community's daily existence. In ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, the preparation and consumption of drinks were often tied to ritual and ceremony. The act of drinking was woven into the fabric of daily life, serving as a moment of connection to both the divine and to one another. In Egypt, for example, the goddess Hathor, the goddess of love and joy, was also associated with beer, a drink that was as common as water itself. The laborers who built the Great Pyramids would drink beer, and not just any beer, but a form of it that was crafted to nourish, sustain, and comfort them during their hard work. Beer in the ancient world wasn't something merely for indulgence or relaxation. It was a staple, a drink tied to labor, to life itself. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians brewed a beer-like beverage from barley, and it was consumed in the temples, in households, and during communal gatherings. But even more than that, it was woven into the spiritual practices of the time. Drinking was not simply about satisfying a physical need. It was also about participating in a cycle of life, a shared experience that connected you to your community, to your ancestors, and even to the gods themselves. Wine, too, held a special place in many ancient civilizations. It was the drink of gods and kings, and the act of drinking wine was a sacred one, sometimes even offered as a libation to honor deities. In Greece, wine was consumed at the symposium, a social gathering that was as much about intellectual conversation as it was about enjoying the fruits of the vine. The practice of drinking wine was also an art form, one in which the right type of wine, the right amount, and the proper social etiquette all played a role in bringing people together. And yet, even in the homes of common folk, these drinks were an essential part of life. Whether it was water from the well, a simple, daily brew of fermented grains, or the rare indulgence of wine or beer, these drinks served more than just a practical purpose. They were a form of social currency, a tool for connection, and in many ways, they were seen as a gift from the gods, a symbol of the earth's fertility and the interconnectedness of life. As you take another sip, you can almost feel the weight of history in that simple action. The ancient world was, in many ways, defined by the drinks people consumed. These drinks were not just beverages. They were an essential part of survival, of spirituality, of community, and of social status. Now, as you sit back and reflect on that first sip, think for a moment, what would it have felt like to wake up in one of those ancient homes? To rise from sleep and to begin your day with the drink of your time? Was it water that you reached for first? A fermented drink, perhaps? Or maybe something else entirely? How would it have connected you to the world around you, to your ancestors, to the earth itself? Take a deep breath now and let that thought settle with you as we move deeper into the story of how drinking shaped the lives of people in ancient civilizations. how these drinks were far more than mere sustenance. They were, in their own way, the thread that tied people to their past, to each other, and to the very earth that sustained them. Imagine, for a moment, the simplicity of waking up in the morning, the soft sounds of nature greeting you as the sun rises over the horizon. Yet, as you stretch and prepare for the day ahead, one thought lingers in your mind: the thirst. It is a thirst that does not come easily quenched, for the water you drink is not just a turn of the tap, but a journey. The water you rely on is scarce, valuable, and most importantly, sacred. In the ancient world, water was not a luxury, it was the very essence of life itself. Without it, nothing could grow, no civilization could thrive. It was the foundation upon which entire cities and cultures were built. Imagine, then, the great cities of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians lived by the great Tigris and Euphrates rivers, or the fertile banks of the Nile in Egypt. These rivers, and the water they provided, were the heartbeat of life in these civilizations. They were the lifeblood that nourished the crops, the animals, and the people who relied on them to survive. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians constructed elaborate systems to source, store, and distribute water. The rivers might have flowed through the land, but it was up to the people to ensure that it reached every household and field. They built intricate canals, channels, and wells to carry the water to the heart of their cities, making sure it was available where it was needed most. The art of water management was something of an early science, as the people learned how to harness the natural flow of rivers and streams, using it to irrigate their crops and provide water to their people. In a way, their survival depended on their mastery of this element. Without the water, they could not grow the barley and wheat that sustained their daily lives. But water was more than just a necessity. It was revered and respected as a divine gift. In Mesopotamia, the river gods were worshipped, and the very act of bringing water into the home was seen as a form of reverence. The Sumerians believed that water was a life-giving force sent from the heavens, a sacred element that connected the mortal world to the divine. They often included water in their religious ceremonies, offering it to their gods as a symbol of purity and renewal. Imagine, then, the great temples dedicated to these gods, where priests would pour water in sacred rituals, acknowledging its importance in both spiritual and physical realms. In Egypt, the Nile River held a similar place of reverence. The Egyptians had an almost mystical relationship with the river, which flowed annually, flooding its banks and leaving behind rich, fertile soil. This predictable flood cycle, known as the inundation, was seen as a blessing from the gods. To the Egyptians, the river was not just a source of water, it was a manifestation of the divine, a symbol of life, death, and rebirth. Every year, the floodwaters would renew the land, ensuring a bountiful harvest for the people. They constructed elaborate irrigation systems to control the flow of water, using it to irrigate crops, water livestock, and sustain the bustling cities along the river's edge. In the grand temples dedicated to their gods, water flowed freely in sacred pools, where the high priests and the pharaohs would offer prayers for fertility and abundance. Water was life, and in its presence, the Egyptians found a spiritual connection to the divine forces that shaped their world. Now think of the ancient Indus Valley, where the people lived in cities such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, thousands of years before the rise of Egypt or Mesopotamia. These cities were laid out with impressive precision, each one equipped with a network of wells and drainage systems that were ahead of their time. It is said that the Indus Valley people were some of the first to establish a city-wide water management system. Wells were dug into the earth, and water was drawn from these sources with the help of early pumps and other devices. The drainage systems ensured that the water was not only available for daily use, but also that it could flow away from the streets, keeping the cities clean and safe. To live in the Indus Valley was to live with water in mind at every moment. From the sacred baths that were used for purification rituals to the everyday use of water for drinking and cooking, it was something that the people took great care in managing. Water was not just for survival. It was an essential part of their culture, their daily rituals, and their understanding of the world around them. Water's importance also extended into the spiritual lives of these ancient people. In each civilization, water was used to purify and cleanse not just bodies, but spirits. The act of bathing in sacred rivers or pools was seen as a way to wash away sign and impurity, bringing the soul closer to the divine. In many temples, water was used in rituals to symbolize the purification of both the body and the mind. The sound of water gently lapping against stone would echo through these sacred spaces, creating a sense of calm and reverence. In this way, water was more than just a physical resource, it was a pathway to spiritual renewal. As we pause here, I ask you to consider something. Can you imagine a life where clean, easily accessible water was not a given? A life where you had to make the journey to the river or the well, perhaps risking dangers along the way, just to quench your thirst? Water was not always as easily accessible as it is today. The act of retrieving water was often a task fraught with effort, and yet it was an essential part of life. I wonder, as you listen to this, how much you now value the simple act of turning on a faucet to get a glass of clean water. How would your life change if you had to work for each drop, just as those ancient people did? It's humbling, isn't it? The importance of water is something we can easily take for granted today, but in the ancient world, it was not just a lifeline, it was a gift, one that was nurtured, revered, and fought for. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. How does water shape your own life today, and what might it have meant in those early days when it was not so easily come by? The smell of barley and yeast fills the air as the brew slowly ferments. The earth beneath your feet is firm, but the world around you hums with a quiet energy. There is something ancient and sacred about the process of brewing, something that has been passed down through generations, each one perfecting the art. And here you are, standing among the first people to truly understand the power of fermentation. A simple drink, but one that will shape not only the way you live, but the way you view the world. In the ancient world, beer and wine were more than mere beverages. They were the lifeblood of daily existence, as integral to life as water itself. From the dusty plains of Mesopotamia to the sun-drenched vineyards of ancient Greece, people across civilizations raised their cups in honor of the divine, celebrated victories with a sip, and gathered around tables to share these drinks in community. Beer and wine were not only drinks, they were symbols of connection, of the sacred, and of survival. Beer was the drink of the common folk. The Sumerians, the first to brew beer over 5,000 years ago, understood the importance of fermentation and the nourishment that came from their brews. Imagine the laborers in Mesopotamia, hunched over in the fields, working tirelessly to sow and reap the barley, a crop that would soon become the cornerstone of their daily lives. When the work of the day was done, the reward was beer thick, hearty, and nourishing. It was not just a beverage. It was a meal in itself, one that provided the necessary sustenance to continue the cycle of labor. The process of brewing was a delicate one. The grains were soaked, mashed, and fermented in large clay vessels. The Sumerians didn't have the refined brewing equipment we are accustomed to today, but their methods were effective, and the resulting beer became the cornerstone of their culture. Unlike the clear, crisp beers of today, the beer of ancient Mesopotamia would have been thick and porridge-like, with a slightly sour taste. It was often drunk through straws, as the solid grains and sediment would have made it difficult to consume any other way. But it was more than just the drink, it was a connection to the earth, to the harvest, and to the divine. Beer was so central to Sumerian life that it was even mentioned in their most sacred texts. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest works of literature, the hero Gilgamesh shares a drink with the gods. The gods, of course, are not drinking water or some simple refreshment. They are drinking beer, a symbol of their power, their joy, and their connection to humanity. The very act of drinking beer in the presence of the gods was seen as a sacred experience, a ritual that brought the divine and the mortal worlds together. In this way, beer was much more than just a drink. It was an offering, a form of communion between the people and the gods. Wine, on the other hand, was the drink of the elite, enjoyed by kings, priests, and philosophers alike. The ancient Greeks, with their love for intellectual discourse and refined living, were perhaps the most famous consumers of wine in antiquity. Wine was a symbol of status, sophistication, and social distinction. The Greeks often consumed wine in a communal setting. Gathering together at symposia drinking parties where the rich and powerful would come together to share a meal, debate ideas, and celebrate their culture. But wine, like beer, was not simply about indulgence, it was about ritual. The Greeks viewed wine as a gift from the gods, particularly Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and ecstasy. The act of drinking wine was often tied to religious worship, where the gods were honored with offerings of wine. Imagine, then, the celebratory atmosphere of the symposium, where wine flowed freely and the guests would drink to the health of their gods and to the joy of life. The ritual of drinking wine in these settings was more than just about pleasure, it was a deeply spiritual experience, a moment of connection with the divine and a celebration of community. In ancient Rome, the consumption of wine was similarly entwined with both social and religious rituals. The Romans, ever practical, also recognized the value of wine as a preservative and as a way to ease the hardships of daily life. Wine was often diluted with water, and it was consumed regularly by people of all social classes. However, just as in Greece, the act of drinking wine in the company of others carried with it a sense of unity, a shared experience that transcended the mundane and connected the drinkers to something greater than themselves. The act of drinking was not just about quenching thirst, it was about ritual, about socializing, and about creating bonds between individuals, between people and the divine, and between the living and the gods. Whether it was the thick, nourishing beer of Mesopotamia or the finely crafted wine of the Greeks and Romans, these drinks were woven into the fabric of daily life. They were celebrated at feasts, honored in religious ceremonies, and shared with friends and strangers alike. And as they sipped their drinks, ancient people were not just enjoying a moment of pleasure, they were participating in a tradition that had been passed down through generations, a tradition that connected them to their ancestors, to their gods, and to each other. Now, as you sit back and reflect on the world of ancient drinking, I ask you to imagine something. What would it have been like to drink wine in the company of gods? To sit at a grand feast, surrounded by the finest wine and the best of company, and know that each sip was not just for pleasure, but for something greater, a moment of connection to the divine. What do you think it would feel like to share a drink with a god, to offer your wine to them in the same way the ancient people did? Perhaps even now, you can feel the weight of that ancient tradition, a tradition that has lasted for thousands of years, where the simple act of drinking has been a sacred, communal, and life-affirming experience. As you reflect on this, think about how alcohol shapes your own social life today. How does a glass of wine or a cold beer change the atmosphere around you? Does it bring people together? Does it enhance the sense of connection, the shared experience? It's fascinating to consider how these ancient practices have endured, how the rituals of drinking have shaped our lives across the millennia. Let me know your thoughts. How does alcohol play a role in your life today? And how do you think it would have felt to drink in the ancient world with the gods themselves? The air is thick with the scent of incense as you step into the temple. The golden light of the setting sun filters through the high windows, casting long shadows across the stone floors. The sounds of chanting rise and fall in rhythm as the gathered crowd bows their heads in reverence to the gods. You are not just a bystander in this sacred place. You are a woman of great power and influence, and your presence here is not merely symbolic. In ancient Greece, as in many other civilizations, women had their own unique and often underappreciated relationship with the sacred act of drinking. In ancient societies, the act of drinking was frequently tied to the gods, to ritual, and to power. While men often took center stage in many of these rites, women played an equally important and sometimes more subtle role in shaping the culture around alcohol, particularly when it came to religious and social gatherings. From the priestesses of ancient Greece to the noble women of Mesopotamia, women had a hand in shaping the drinking rituals of their time, influencing everything from the production of wine to its consumption in sacred and social settings. In ancient Greece, the symposium, a communal drinking party, was an event reserved for men, typically those of high social standing. This was a space for philosophical debates, discussions on politics, and socializing over wine, a drink that was considered a gift from the gods. Yet there was an important exception, the women who held sacred roles in these rituals. Priestesses, for example, were key figures in religious ceremonies that involved drinking, particularly in the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and ecstasy. These priestesses were not mere spectators, they were active participants, often responsible for preparing the wine, offering it to the gods, and sometimes even partaking in the divine drink themselves. Imagine the weight of this responsibility. As a priestess, you were entrusted with the power to commune with the gods through the very act of drinking. Your role was not only spiritual but also political, as the rituals you oversaw were deeply intertwined with the health and well-being of the community. The Greeks believed that Dionysus could bestow blessings or curses upon the land based on the success of his worship. And so, the women who served as his intermediaries held a great deal of sway. However, despite their power in the religious sphere, women's involvement in the social drinking spaces of ancient Greece was far more restricted. Women were typically excluded from the symposium, the space where men gathered to drink wine and share intellectual ideas. This division was emblematic of the larger gender roles that defined the ancient world. Yet there were spaces where women did drink in their own right. For example, women in ancient Greece were known to drink wine during domestic gatherings and festivals, though their consumption was often more moderated than that of their male counterparts. Their role in these social settings, though lesser in scope than that of men, was no less important. Moving to Mesopotamia, we see a more nuanced picture. Women in this ancient civilization, particularly those of noble birth, wielded considerable power in the religious and social domains. Queen Shiptu of Mari, for instance, held sway not only over the political matters of her kingdom, but also over the ceremonial drinking that was integral to her courtess rituals. It was common for royal women to host elaborate feasts, where wine flowed freely and the drink was served in vessels decorated with intricate designs. For these women, the act of drinking was not merely about indulgence. It was an expression of status, of power, and of control over the sacred space of the feast. In the ancient Near East, women also played an important role in the production and distribution of alcohol, particularly beer. In the Sumerian culture, women were often responsible for brewing beer, a staple drink that was both a food and a beverage. The Sumerians revered the goddess Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, and her role was central to both the creation and consumption of alcohol. Women worked in breweries where they carefully prepared the ingredients and oversaw the fermentation process. The beer they brewed was consumed by everyone from the laborers working the fields to the kings in their palaces, but it was also deeply connected to the divine, as the drink was often part of religious offerings and ceremonies. While the role of women in ancient drinking rituals was often shaped by the constraints of their time, it is clear that their influence was far from insignificant. Women were not simply passive participants in the consumption of alcohol, they were the creators, the stewards, and the sacred conduits through which the act of drinking connected the mortal world to the divine. Whether brewing beer in the temples, presiding over the rituals of the gods, or participating in feasts and banquets, women's relationship with alcohol was multifaceted and powerful. But the question remains, what did it mean for women in these civilizations to control or participate in such sacred acts? What did it mean for them to have such power over the rituals of drinking, rituals that were so intimately tied to the gods and to the very survival of their communities? Take a moment to reflect on this. What does it mean when women hold sway over the rituals of drinking? How might it have felt to be a priestess responsible for offering wine to the gods, or a queen hosting a grand feast where the wine was poured as a symbol of power and prestige? It's not just about drinking, it's about control, about connection, and about the sacred responsibilities that come with holding such power. Now think about your own life. How does gender shape your drinking customs today? Do you see a reflection of these ancient roles in the way men and women drink, socialize, and share in the rituals of their own lives? The act of drinking has always been more than just about the beverage as a reflection of power, tradition, and in many ways a mirror to the roles we occupy in society. As you consider these questions, remember the ancient women who helped shape the drinking rituals of their time. Their influence, though often overlooked, was integral to the way alcohol was used to connect with the divine, to celebrate community and to mark the most important moments in life. Picture yourself standing in the warm glow of an ancient workshop, the faint scent of yeast and barley filling the air. Your hands are working, kneading the dough for beer, mixing ingredients with purpose. There's a rhythm to the process, an ancient art that has been passed down for generations. The grain is carefully ground, the water measured with precision, and the fermentation process, though still a mystery to many, is unfolding before your eyes. This is where the magic of brewing begins, not in the hands of kings or gods, but in the hands of the workers, the craftsmen and women who have perfected the process over time. The act of brewing alcohol in the ancient world was not a simple task. It required skill, patience, and an intimate understanding of the materials at hand. In Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and China, the brewing of beer, wine, and other fermented beverages was considered both a craft and a science and intricate process that combined practical knowledge with the mysterious power of fermentation. To brew in the ancient world was to participate in an ancient tradition, one that brought communities together and created drinks that were not just nourishing but sacred. In ancient Egypt, the brewing process began with barley and water, much like the beers we know today, but it was a more labor-intensive and slow-paced procedure. The Egyptians didn't have the fine brewing machinery that we do now. Instead, they relied on their hands, their senses, and their instincts. Barley was soaked in water and then allowed to ferment in large clay pots. The process wasn't just about mixing ingredients. It was about timing, temperature, and letting the earth work its magic. The beer that emerged from these processes was thick, porridge-like, and often consumed with a spoon. It was a drink meant to nourish as much as to refresh, a drink that provided sustenance for the long hours of labor. Imagine, then, the artisans working at the brewery's women and men, hands stained with the grains of the harvest, tending to the brewing pots with careful attention. The brewing process was slow, deliberate, and done in small batches. It was an art, and the brewers were seen as highly skilled craftsmen, their work valued not just for its practical use, but for its connection to the divine. Beer, after all, was sacred to the Egyptians, and it was often offered to the gods in rituals and ceremonies. The careful preparation of the brew was seen as an act of reverence, as the beer was consumed during religious feasts and offerings. In ancient Mesopotamia, the process was much the same. The Sumerians and Babylonians brewed their beer in large clay vessels, using barley and emmer wheat as the primary ingredients. They also brewed for ritual purposes, with beer used in religious ceremonies as an offering to the gods. The brewing itself was a deeply respected craft, with women often tasked with brewing the beer in temples and homes. These women, known as tavern keepers, were not only brewers but also the keepers of sacred knowledge, overseeing the fermentation process that was thought to connect mortals to the divine. In this way, brewing wasn't just a profession, it was a responsibility, one that shaped the way the community experienced both the physical and spiritual worlds. As the Sumerians perfected their brewing techniques, they began to refine the process, adding more complex flavors and variations. It wasn't just about creating a drink that would quench the thirst. It was about crafting something that was worthy of the gods, something that would bring people together in shared experiences. The art of brewing, then, became about more than just the drink. It was about community, about ceremony, and about connection. Can you imagine for a moment standing beside a brewer in ancient Mesopotamia, watching as they knead the dough, shaping it with practiced hands, and placing it into the fermentation pots? The process was not quick, but it was full of purpose. It was a slow, deliberate act of creation, one that would result in a drink that could nourish, heal, and bring people together. Over in ancient Greece, brewing was an art that took on its own distinct shape. The Greeks were perhaps most famous for their wine, which they fermented from grapes grown in the fertile valleys of the Mediterranean. But brewing wine was no less of a craft than brewing beer. The process began with the harvest of grapes, which were then crushed to release their juice. The juice was left to ferment in large clay vessels called amphorae. The Greeks, like the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, didn't have advanced machinery to aid in their work. They relied on their hands and their senses, the temperature of the wine. The movement of the air, the way the yeast bubbled as it worked its magic. Imagine the winemakers standing in the vineyards with the sun on their backs, gathering the grapes that would become the drink of the gods. The harvest was an event in itself, a celebration of nature's bounty. Once the grapes were crushed, the juice began its slow transformation into wine. This fermentation process was a delicate dance of nature, where the right balance of time, temperature, and air would determine the quality of the wine. The Greeks had a deep understanding of this process, and the resulting wine wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of their culture. A drink consumed at symposia and religious festivals, and a symbol of the connection between the divine and the mortal. Meanwhile, in ancient China, the brewing process took a different shape altogether. The Chinese were known for their rice wines, fermented from rice, barley, and sometimes fruits like plums. These drinks were made in small batches, often in homes or small local breweries. The process involved steaming the rice, which was then mixed with a fermenting agent known as ku. The rice was left to ferment, turning into a sweet, often cloudy beverage that could be consumed both for enjoyment and medicinal purposes. Like the brewing of beer and wine in the West, the brewing of rice wine was an art form that was passed down through generations, with families often taking pride in their craft. Can you picture yourself standing in an ancient Chinese home, watching the steam rise from the rice, feeling the warmth of the brewing process as it fills the air? The act of brewing here was just as sacred as it was in Egypt or Mesopotamia, and like the other ancient civilizations, it was an act of creation, of transforming the raw into something much more. The smell of fermenting rice, the rhythmic pulse of the brewing process, it all spoke to a deep respect for nature, for craftsmanship, and for the sacredness of the drink that would emerge. Now, as you think about these ancient brewing processes, I ask you to reflect. Can you picture yourself kneading the dough for beer or watching the fermentation process unfold before you? Can you feel the connection between the brewer and the drink? The way they carefully crafted something that would not only sustain the body, but nourish the soul? The process may have been slow and meticulous, but it was imbued with purpose and reverence. Today, we often take craftsmanship for granted, relying on machines and technology to do the work that once required so much skill and attention. Yet the process of creating something by hand, something that requires patience and knowledge, still holds great value. As you reflect on the brewing traditions of the past, think about how much we value craftsmanship today. How often do we stop to consider the process that goes into the things we consume? What would it be like to step back into an ancient world where every brew was made with intention, every drink crafted with care, and every sip taken with reverence? The sun sets slowly, casting its soft golden light over a grand banquet hall. The rich scent of roasted meats, spices, and wine fills the air as laughter and conversation mix with the clinking of fine cups. At the head of the table, a king or queen sits, their wine served in ornate goblets, surrounded by the nobles and elites of the land. Meanwhile, outside the opulent walls of the palace, a different scene unfolds, a humble gathering of workers, and common folk sharing their own drinks, not from golden cups, but from clay vessels and simple mugs. The wine may be rougher, the beer more filling, but the sense of community is no less strong. In the ancient world, drinking was not merely about quenching thirst. It was an act deeply embedded in the social fabric of the time. Who drank, what they drank, and where they drank often signified much more than personal preference. It was a reflection of one's place within the social hierarchy, a tool that reinforced power, status, and division. The drink you sipped, whether a richly fermented wine, a hearty beer, or a simple water from the well, spoke volumes about your position in society? Let us begin by turning our gaze to the banquets of ancient Egypt, where the elite drank wine from the finest vessels, their cups often etched with the symbols of their wealth and power. Wine in ancient Egypt was the drink of the gods and the privileged. While beer was consumed widely by the common people, wine was reserved for the upper classes. Only the nobility, priests, and the royal family had access to the finest wines, which were often imported from distant lands like the Levant. These elite banquets were not just social gatherings. They were opportunities to display wealth, to cement one's status, and to establish political alliances. At these gatherings, the wine was not merely a drink, it was a symbol of control, of the distance between the powerful and the common folk. It was often during these lavish feasts that the pharaoh would entertain foreign dignitaries, ensuring that the display of abundance would strengthen his rule and impress upon others the might of Egypt. The wine was carefully chosen to reflect this power, a beverage that was not just consumed, but experienced as a part of an elaborate ritual of showing dominance. Contrast this with the common folk of Egypt, who drank beer as a daily staple. The beer was thick, sometimes porridge-like, and served in simple clay mugs or large vessels. It was nourishing and provided sustenance for the laborers working in the fields and on the grand construction projects that dotted the Egyptian landscape. Beer was also consumed during religious ceremonies and rituals, but it was seen more as a gift from the gods to the people rather than a luxury of the wealthy. While the beer in Egypt was integral to daily life, it was never regarded with the same reverence or ceremonial importance as wine. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians shared a similar distinction between the drinking customs of the elites and the commoners. Beer, like in Egypt, was the drink of the everyday person, from the laborers to the farmers, and it played an essential role in daily life. But wine was reserved for the upper classes, for the kings and queens, and was considered a symbol of divine favor. Beer, as nourishing as it was, could not compare to the richness of wine in the eyes of the elites. It was during feasts and religious ceremonies that the stark contrast between the common folk and the aristocracy became most apparent. The elite class would often drink wine in large, lavish banquets, while the common folk gathered in humble taverns, drinking their beer and sharing stories of their day. One of the most interesting aspects of drinking in ancient civilizations was the way it both reinforced and subtly challenged social hierarchies. In Rome, for instance, the consumption of wine was a sign of status, but it also created spaces where boundaries were crossed, and the lower classes could, for a time, experience the privileges of the elite. While the elite Romans enjoyed fine wines at the symposia, their grand drinking parties, the common citizens had their own version of these gatherings. In the taverns of Rome, people from all walks of life would gather, often to drink cheaper, more rustic wines, but also to engage in conversations, sing songs, and even indulge in heated debates about politics or philosophy. For the Romans, drinking was a way to assert social boundaries, but it was also a way to create a sense of unity. The exclusion of certain groups from high-status drinking rituals, particularly women and slaves, was an important way of reinforcing social divisions. However, this exclusion also created spaces for rebellion, solidarity, and subversion. For example, while women were often excluded from the symposiums, they could, at times, host their own drinking events in their homes, where they would engage in their own forms of intellectual exchange. The power of these spaces, though limited, was significant, as it gave women a rare opportunity to exert influence over the social dynamics of drinking. The ancient Greeks, known for their complex social structures, also had a clear distinction between the drinking habits of the elites and the common folk. The symposium, a drinking party that was integral to Greek culture, was reserved for wealthy men who would gather to drink wine, discuss philosophy, and celebrate their status. These events were exclusive spaces where ideas and power were exchanged along with wine. The drink itself was central to the event, serving as both a facilitator of intellectual discussion and a sign of social standing. But even within the context of these exclusive drinking rituals, the act of drinking could transcend social boundaries. In some instances, the symposium would open its doors to slaves and women, but only under certain conditions. The most important of these was the ability to hold one's wine, to drink without becoming too intoxicated, and to participate in the conversation. For many, this was a way to assert equality, at least for the duration of the event. The very act of sharing wine, of drinking together, created a momentary sense of unity that could cut across the strict boundaries of class and gender. This brings us to the question, who do you drink with, and what does that say about your relationships? When you share a drink with friends, family, or colleagues, you are engaging in a time-honored social ritual that transcends simple consumption. Think about the last time you raised a glass, whether it was to celebrate a victory, share a quiet moment, or simply pass the time. Who were you with? What was the occasion? And more importantly, what does it say about the place alcohol holds in your social life today? In the ancient world, drinking was both a privilege and a means of reinforcing social hierarchies. But it also provided moments where people could break through those boundaries, if only for a short while. It was a tool for both exclusion and inclusion, for the rich to showcase their wealth and for the common folk to carve out their own spaces of connection and community. Today, as you think about your own social circles and the drinks that mark your gatherings, I invite you to reflect, how much do our drinking customs still reflect the hierarchies of the past? And in what ways do we, like the ancients, use alcohol to forge connections and solidarity across boundaries? The air in the temple is thick with the scent of incense, swirling around you like a soft, fragrant mist. The flicker of torchlight dances against the stone walls, casting shadows that seem to move with a life of their own. The sound of chanting rises and falls, soft and rhythmic, as priests and priestesses gather around an altar, preparing to offer the sacred drink. The vessel before them, filled with the finest wine or beer, is not just a drink, it is a conduit, a bridge between the mortal world and the divine. In ancient civilizations, drinking was never just an act of consumption. It was a deeply spiritual experience, an offering, a ritual that connected people to the gods, to the earth, and to one another. Whether it was wine in the temples of Greece, beer in the holy spaces of Mesopotamia, or the sacred rice wine in China, these drinks were imbued with more than just physical sustenance. They were acts of devotion, of reverence, and of ritual. In ancient Greece, drinking was inherently tied to the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and ecstasy. The Greek symposium, a gathering of elite men to drink, discuss philosophy, and engage in intellectual exchange, was not just a social event. It was, in its own way, a sacred act where wine was consumed as a gift from Dionysus. The wine offered to the god at the beginning of the evening was not just a drink, it was a way to honor the divine, to acknowledge the god's role in the pleasures of life and the mysteries of the universe. Imagine yourself sitting at the symposium, a goblet of wine in your hand. The conversation flows around you: politics, philosophy, poetry, but at the start, before the intellectual discourse begins, there is a moment of silence. The first sip is offered to Dionysus. This act, this small gesture, is a sacred moment, a recognition of the god's presence. The wine in that moment is not just a beverage, it is a symbol of the divine, a means of communing with the god who, in Greek belief, governed both the joys and excesses of life. Similarly, in ancient Egypt, drinking was intrinsically tied to religious rituals. Wine and beer were offered to the gods in temples, poured out as sacrifices to honor deities like Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and Hathor, the goddess of joy and music. But it wasn't just about offerings to the gods. The people of Egypt believed that by consuming these sacred drinks, they could connect more deeply with the divine. Imagine, for a moment, standing in a temple, the warm air of the Nile basin filling your lungs as you participate in a ritual. The priest raises the cup, the golden liquid reflecting the light of the candles, and pours it out onto the altar in a gesture of reverence. This is not just about drinking. It is about communion with the divine, about acknowledging the life-giving force of the gods who provide sustenance and joy. Beer, especially, had a sacred place in ancient Egyptian life. While the elite drank wine, the common folk consumed beer, a drink that was not only a staple of daily life, but also a central element of religious offerings. Beer was often placed on altars, poured out as an offering to the gods in the belief that it would bring blessings of abundance and fertility. Beer was seen as a gift from the earth, a drink of the people, and yet it was elevated to a divine status when offered to the gods. In this way, the simple act of drinking beer became a ritual, a means of connecting with the divine power that sustained life. In Mesopotamia, the role of drinking in religious rituals was similarly profound. The Sumerians and Babylonians believed that beer, along with wine, was a gift from the gods, particularly the goddess Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. The very process of brewing beer was considered sacred, a craft that involved the help of divine forces. Beer was consumed in temples during ceremonies to honor the gods, and it was often used in sacrifices. The act of drinking was a way to offer gratitude and seek favor, a way to acknowledge the gods who controlled the forces of nature and ensured the prosperity of the land. One of the most significant rituals in ancient Mesopotamia was the beer offering. Beer would be poured into a vessel, and a portion would be set aside as an offering to the gods. The people believed that in this simple act of sharing their drink, they were participating in a divine exchange. The drinking of beer, in this context, was not just a communal activity, it was a sacred, purposeful act, one that forged a connection between the mortal and divine realms. Now, as we pause here, imagine yourself in the midst of one of these ancient rituals. Can you hear the soft chants, the rhythm of prayers, the flickering of candles and incense? Can you see the sacred vessels being raised, the first sip offered to the gods? The air feels thick with reverence, and the act of drinking is no longer just about thirst, it's about something far deeper. It's about honoring the divine, about partaking in the blessings of the gods, and about sharing in a moment of sacred communion. Take a moment to reflect. What are the rituals surrounding drinking in your own life? Perhaps it's a toast with friends, a quiet sip shared in the company of family, or the act of pouring a drink in a quiet, reflective moment. Whether it's an elaborate ceremony or a simple act, there is something deeply sacred in these rituals. We might not be pouring wine as an offering to Dionysus or sharing beer in a temple, but there is still something about drinking together that brings us closer to one another, and perhaps even to something greater than ourselves. The sacred nature of drinking is not confined to the past, it lives on in the quiet moments of our own lives. Can you imagine as you sip your drink, whether in celebration or reflection, that you too are participating in a tradition that has spanned millennia? In every culture from ancient Greece to Mesopotamia to Egypt, the act of drinking has been more than just a physical need. It's been a spiritual, sacred experience, one that connects us to the earth, to the divine, and to each other. Whether we drink in moments of joy or sorrow, in ritual or in casual gathering, the act of sharing a drink remains, in its simplest form, an act of communion. And perhaps in that communion we touch something timeless, something that reaches beyond our own lives into the vast flow of history. The day begins in the warmth of a humble home, the scent of fresh bread rising from the clay oven, mingling with the earthy smell of freshly tilled soil. The sunlight filters through the narrow window, casting soft shadows across the stone floor. Outside, the hustle of the village starts to pick up. The clatter of carts, the murmurs of neighbors, the laughter of children, these sounds fill the morning air. In this world, there is no rush to gather, no hurried trips to the corner store to grab a cold drink. Instead, the beverage of choice for the day is prepared at home, woven into the daily rhythms of life. For the common folk in ancient civilizations, drinking wasn't just about quenching thirst. It was about connection, nourishment, and survival. The drinks they consumed, whether it was thick beer, diluted wine, fermented grain beverages, or simple water from the well, were the lifeblood of daily existence. Each drink had its purpose, not only to satisfy the body, but also to bring people together, to forge relationships, and to keep the cycle of life flowing smoothly. Take, for example, the workers in ancient Mesopotamia who toiled away in the fields under the scorching sun. Their drink of choice was beer, a simple, hearty beverage made from barley. It was not the fine, sparkling wine reserved for the elites, but it was no less significant. Beer in ancient Mesopotamia was nourishing, often served thick and porridge-like, designed to provide sustenance as much as refreshment. The laborers would drink it throughout the day, their bodies fueled by the barley that had been painstakingly harvested and brewed. Imagine yourself in their place. The work is demanding, but the beer is a constant companion, a drink that not only fills the stomach but also creates a bond between you and your fellow workers. The simple act of sharing this drink, passed around in clay mugs, becomes a moment of camaraderie, a shared experience that ties the group together. It's a drink that marks the beginning and end of the day, a reminder of the labor and effort that makes life possible. In ancient Egypt, the common people would also drink beer, but it was often served alongside water, the most essential of all beverages. Water, drawn from the Nile or from wells, was a staple of daily life. It wasn't just a means of quenching thirst. It was the foundation of every meal, the drink that nourished the body and kept it going through the long days of work. The simplicity of water in ancient Egypt, much like in other ancient civilizations, should not be underestimated. It was the very essence of life, and without it, nothing could survive. For the everyday Egyptian, water wasn't just for drinking. It was a part of ritual, a sacred element that connected them to the gods. Imagine standing beside a well, drawing the water up with a simple rope and bucket, the coolness of it refreshing you after a long day under the hot sun. There's something deeply grounding about this moment, a simple, repetitive action that speaks to the connection between the people and the land, between the labor of the hands and the rewards of the earth. As you consider the daily life of these ancient people, think about the act of drinking itself. What would it have felt like to sit down with your family after a long day of work and to share a simple, humble drink together? Perhaps it was the thick, nourishing beer of Mesopotamia or the cool water of Egypt. In these moments, drinking wasn't just about the beverage, it was about the shared experience, the connection between people and the quiet ritual of life. It was a part of what made each day worth living. In the ancient world, drinking was also a social act, a way to build relationships and form bonds. In the marketplaces and town squares, men and women would gather to drink and share stories. Whether it was a shared cup of beer or a moment of laughter over a jug of wine, these moments of connection were integral to the fabric of society. It was in these spaces, these humble, everyday spaces, that the true meaning of drinking in the ancient world was revealed. It wasn't about luxury or excess. It was about human connection, about sustaining the bonds that held a community together. In the homes of common people, too, drinking was a central part of family life. After a long day, families would gather around the hearth, perhaps sharing a meal of bread and vegetables, with a simple cup of beer or wine passed around the table. These quiet moments, where the drink was shared between family members, were a way of marking the passage of time, of coming together at the end of the day. The beverage itself may have been simple, but the act of sharing it was sacred. It was a reminder that, despite the hardships of daily life, there was always room for connection, for nourishment, and for community. And yet, it wasn't always just the drink itself that mattered, it was the context in which it was consumed. Think of the family gathered around the table, the soft laughter echoing through the room, the warmth of the hearth filling the space. Perhaps it was a simple brew made from barley, or maybe it was water from the well, refreshing and pure. The drink itself wasn't the most important part, it was the sharing of it, the coming together as a family or a community that gave it meaning. Now, I invite you to pause for a moment and reflect. How would you feel if your only drink of choice was a simple, daily brew shared with family? Would it change the way you think about the drinks you consume today? In the modern world, we often take for granted the vast variety of beverages available to us. We have access to nearly any drink we desire, often without thinking twice about it. But in the ancient world, drinking was tied to survival, to the very essence of daily life. The drink wasn't just a convenience, it was a lifeline, a way to sustain the body and connect with others. How have your own drinking habits changed over time? What would it be like if, for a moment, you returned to that simplicity, sharing a humble drink with the people you love most? In this quiet, reflective moment, we are reminded of the importance of drinking in the lives of everyday people throughout history. Whether it was the thick beer of Mesopotamia, the refreshing water of Egypt, or the humble beverages shared among family, drinking was always a symbol of connection and act that tied people together, whether through labor, ritual, or simple companionship. In the ancient world, the drinks may have been simple, but the meaning behind them was profound. As the centuries passed, the act of drinking underwent many changes, evolving along with the societies that practiced it. Yet beneath these transformations, there remains an undeniable thread that connects the ancient drinking customs with those of today. The rituals, the shared cups, the sacredness of drinking these elements, which once defined the social and spiritual lives of ancient civilizations, continue to shape how we drink, how we gather, and how we connect. In the ancient world, drinking was deeply embedded in both the spiritual and social fabric of life. The Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, and the Mesopotamians all had distinct drinking customs, but they shared a common understanding of the act as something much greater than mere consumption. To drink was to engage in a sacred ritual, a way of honoring the gods, connecting with others, and marking important moments in life. Whether it was the communal drinking at a symposium in Greece, the beer offerings to the gods in Mesopotamia, or the shared cups at Egyptian feasts, drinking was more than just a physical need. It was a symbol of community, of connection, and of reverence for the divine. Fast forward to today, and many of these ancient customs still live on in subtle ways. We may no longer pour offerings to the gods or gather in sacred temples to drink wine in reverence to Dionysus, but the social aspect of drinking remains as strong as ever. In fact, one might say that the ancient rituals of shared drinking have only been refined over time, becoming the dinner parties, social gatherings, and celebrations we enjoy today. In a sense, we continue to gather around a table, much like our ancient ancestors did, to bond over a drink, whether it's wine, beer, or something else entirely. One of the most lasting legacies of ancient drinking practices is the way in which they have shaped social rituals. The symposium, for example, was not just about drinking, it was about intellectual exchange, friendship, and community. Today, social gatherings where alcohol is served still carry much of that same spirit. Whether it's a family dinner, a celebration with friends, or a casual evening at the pub, the presence of a drink creates a sense of camaraderie, a shared experience that connects people to one another. Of course, there have been changes over time. Modern drinking customs have been influenced by the rise of mass production, global trade, and the availability of a wide range of alcoholic beverages from all over the world. The types of drinks we enjoy today are far more varied than those consumed in the ancient world. Yet, despite the many differences, there remains an unmistakable connection between the drinking practices of the past and our modern-day habits. Take, for example, the evolution of wine. In ancient Greece and Rome, wine was a drink of celebration, of sacred ritual, and of social status. Today, wine still plays a central role in our social lives, whether it's a glass of red at a family dinner, a bottle shared between friends, or the wine served at a wedding. The ritual of uncorking a bottle, pouring the wine, and toasting to good health or prosperity is a practice that has endured for millennia. In this way, the ancient custom of wine as a symbol of connection and celebration is alive and well, albeit in a more modern setting. The same can be said for beer, a drink that was once a staple for the common folk in ancient civilizations. Today, beer remains one of the most widely consumed alcoholic beverages in the world, with countless varieties to choose from. While the brewing process has evolved dramatically, with advances in technology and global distribution, the communal nature of beer drinking has remained a constant. The pub culture, where people gather to share a drink and conversation, is a modern reflection of the communal drinking rituals of ancient times. Even the act of sharing a drink as a form of social bonding continues to thrive today. In ancient Greece, the symposium was a space for intellectual exchange and the strengthening of social bonds. Today, while the topics may differ, the act of coming together to share a drink still fosters conversation, connection, and friendship. It's a universal human experience that transcends time and place, from ancient civilizations to the modern world. However, with these modern changes comes the question of how much has been lost in the process. Ancient drinking customs were deeply tied to rituals, spirituality, and social structures that provided meaning to the act of drinking. In today's fast-paced world, where convenience often trumps ritual, it's easy to lose sight of the deeper significance that drinking once held. The question is, how do we find a balance between the convenience of modern drinking and the reverence of the ancient customs that shaped the way we connect with others in the world around us? As you reflect on this, I ask you, what ancient rituals have influenced your modern life in ways you never noticed? Perhaps it's the way you raise a glass in celebration, or the way you gather with friends and family around a drink. Maybe it's the sense of connection that comes from sharing a drink at a celebration, or the quiet moments of reflection that accompany your own rituals. The next time you gather with loved ones, consider the ancient traditions that have shaped the way we drink today. How much of what we do now is a continuation of those sacred social acts of the past? Drinking has come a long way since its sacred beginnings in the temples and homes of ancient civilizations. But at its core, it remains a reflection of who we are as social creatures. It is an act that unites us, celebrates life, and connects us to the past. And perhaps in that connection, there is a quiet reminder of the long history that lives on in our daily habits, in the drinks we share, and in the rituals we hold dear.